LG's G-Series OLEDs sit atop their TV lineup. This year's flagship LG G6 is an outstanding TV overall, but are you better off saving some cash and getting last year's G5 while it's still available? Spoiler alert, yeah. These two OLEDs have a lot in common, but the G6 does have a couple of advantages, like its top-tier gradient handling. However, the G6 isn't necessarily better across the board. We have plenty of other comparisons to come as well, so make sure to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. But first, we have to get this off our chest. The G6 has received several significant firmware updates since its release. We initially tested the TV with firmware 430267, which had a ton of issues. About a month later, we retested the TV with firmware 431069, which fixed a lot of things. Nice. But there were still some issues with some stuff, especially the TV's HDR real scene performance. We were days away from posting this exact video when LG released firmware 431167, which improved some aspects like color accuracy and greatly improved the TV's real scene HDR brightness. Although the G6 is now in a good state, it's a bit frustrating to say the least that LG and some other brands are taking a page out of the video game industry's playbook, where you release a broken product and rely on firmware updates to fix things over time. It would be nice if a TV just performed as it should when it launched and used firmware updates to refine things instead of fixing them. We're hoping this trend goes away, but we're not holding our breath. Alright, now back to the review. The G5 and G6 are mostly available in the same range of sizes. The 55 to 83 inch use an RGB tandem panel, so performance is consistent across most of the lineup. They're both also available in a 97 inch size, but those use a more standard WOLED panel. The G6 is also widely available in a 48 inch model, and that size still uses a tandem panel. The G5 has a 48 inch model as well, but it's only available in the UK. In the US, all sizes of both TVs come with LG Slim wall mount instead of a stand, so you do need to buy a stand separately if that's what you want to use. However, in some regions, like Canada, you can choose to get the 55 and 65 inch models with a stand instead. Overall, the G5 and the G6 look nearly identical to each other, and they perform really similarly as well. They're both flagships, so you get that top-tier OLED goodness from both TVs. That means both of them display inky blacks with no haloing around highlights and subtitles. They both also have wide viewing angles, which makes them suitable for rooms with large seating arrangements. Our G6 did have a bit more of a green tint than our G5 when viewed from an angle, but this is pretty common on LG OLEDs and varies from unit to unit. Response times are nearly instant, so fast motion is crisp and clear. They both also have the same gaming features, such as 4 HDMI 2.1 ports that support up to 4K at 165Hz with VRR. Color volume is essentially a draw here too, and both TVs can display super punchy, vibrant colors that look great. The G5 and G6 are both super bright TVs, especially for OLEDs. They're both bright enough in SDR to handle glare in a bright room, but the G6 is brighter. The G6 surpasses the SDR peak brightness of the G5 with all of our test slides. It's over 100 nits brighter with a 2% and 10% window, over 200 nits brighter with a 25% window, just under 150 nits brighter with a 50% window, and about 30 nits brighter full screen. On top of that, the G6 is around 300 nits brighter with our SDR real scene test, so it overcomes more glare when you're watching most SDR content. In HDR filmmaker mode, the G6 also performs better. We're talking anywhere from 100 to 900 nits brighter depending on the window size, which should lead to brighter highlights in HDR movies, shows, and games. When we first reviewed the G6, its performance with test slides in HDR didn't translate to real scenes, and the TV was actually quite a bit dimmer than the G5. We rechecked with firmware 431069 in mid-May, and it was still much dimmer than expected. Fortunately, LG released firmware 431167, and it's mostly fixed the G6 real scene performance. The G6 is now about 240 nits brighter with our hallway light scene, and around 30 nits brighter with our landscape pool scene. The G6 is still about 70 nits dimmer than the G5 with our yellow skyscraper test, but that's not a massive difference at all, and the G6 now looks brighter than the G5 in most HDR scenes. If you're willing to sacrifice some accuracy for a brighter HDR image, enabling dynamic tone mapping is a great first step. The G6 is significantly brighter than the G5 when you do that, which is great if you like a super punchy image or need some extra brightness to counteract glare. Whether you're watching SDR content with your brightness maxed out, or you're watching HDR content with dynamic tone mapping enabled, brightness is only going to go so far in handling reflections, especially in darker scenes. That's why reflection handling is such a key factor in bright room performance. The G5 and G6 both use a glossy screen coating, but the G6 utilizes an improved anti-reflection coating that does a better job reducing the intensity of bright lights on the screen, especially direct mirror-like reflections. It's not a night and day difference here, but if you have a window, lamp, or other light source facing your screen, the G6 is the better option. Whether you're watching low-quality DVDs or high-quality HDR content, you don't want to see artifacts or banding on your screen. The G5 does an excellent job of smoothing out artifacts like macro blocking and heavily compressed content, but some detail is lost in the process. The G6 cleans up artifacts just as well, but it does a slightly better job preserving details in the process here. The biggest difference here, and maybe the biggest difference between the two TVs overall, is gradient handling. LG introduced a new 13-bit processing pipeline in 2026, which significantly improves gradients. Outside of some very subtle banding and bright greens, gradients are displayed perfectly on the G6. Let's not kid ourselves, the G5 is still a very solid TV for gradient handling, but there's subtle banding that shows up in some color gradients while the G6 offers some of the best gradient handling on the market. The G5, and many other LG OLEDs from the past couple of years, had subtle, diagonal lines that would appear in near blacks. These lines were only visible if you sat extra close to your screen, but they were distracting to some people. When we initially tested the G6, these lines were gone in HDR10. However, there were even more noticeable spaced out lines in Dolby Vision that were distracting, even from a normal viewing distance. Thankfully, the last firmware update from the G6 completely eliminated these lines. If you sit close to your screen, the G6 is the better option. If you get the G5 and sit at a normal viewing distance though, you should not notice these lines on the G5 at all. So, is the G6 worth the extra cost? For most people, not really. The G6 does perform slightly better in bright rooms, but the G5 is still more than capable here. Although the G6 is brighter in the super accurate HDR filmmaker mode, the difference isn't that big, and most HDR content looks very similar on the two TVs. The G6 does have an advantage when it comes to gradient handling, so it's great if banding bothers you, but the G5 still performs excellently here in that regard. Let's not kid ourselves, both of these TVs are flagships and they're both fantastic. But right now is a great time to get the G5 since you can save yourself a good chunk of cash and it's still one of the best TVs on the market.